Hey, this is Pastor Bunjee Garrett, and I want to take some time today to present you with another word of encouragement. Well, as we continue watching this world being prepared for the rapture of the church and the rise of the Antichrist, it's crucial for Christians to realize that the devil and his demons will do everything they can to lead people astray here in these last days. Here's how Paul put it in 1 Timothy chapter 4. It's verse 1 where he declares, "The Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons." Now that word doctrine comes from a Greek word which was used of teachings and instructions, and so Paul's basically encouraging Pastor Timothy to be on the lookout for those false teachers who are attempting to lead believers astray with doctrines of demons. And as we consider this warning, I think that we do well to take some time to consider the most pervasive demonic doctrine that can be found in many homes throughout the world, even in the homes of Christians. Now, just to be clear, I'm referring to the demonic doctrine that Aleister Crowley introduced back in the 19th century. Crowley was actually born in England in 1875, and while his parents were Christians, Crowley rejected the doctrines of the Bible, and instead he pursued a relationship with the devil. As a matter of fact, Crowley once said this, and I quote him here, "I was not content to believe in a personal devil and serve him in the ordinary sense of the word. I wanted to get a hold of him personally and become his chief of staff." Yeah, Crowley wanted to become his chief of staff, and according to Lawrence Sutton of Hamline University, Crowley actually engaged in a blasphemous ritual during which he crucified a frog, and during that ceremony, Crowley declared this. He says, "Lo, Jesus of Nazareth, how thou art taken in my snare, all my life long thou hast plagued me and affronted me. In thy name, with all other free souls in Christendom, I have been tortured in my boyhood. All delights have been forbidden unto me, and that which is owed to me they pay not in thy name." Crowley then went on to declare over this frog that he was crucifying. He says, "I therefore condemn thee, Jesus, the slave god, to be mocked and spat upon and scourged and then crucified." And then the frog's body was burned to signify the end of this old age. Without debate, Aleister Crowley was an evil man who hated our Savior Jesus, and he even preferred to be referred to as the Great Beast 666 because he wanted to become the Antichrist. And in the process, he made contact with a fallen angel, a demon whose name is Oice. And this demon named Oice told Crowley that he was going to be the man to bring in this new religious system designed to usher in a new age and to destroy Christianity. At that point in time, Crowley began to receive the doctrines of demons from this demon, and he received the doctrines of demons which became known as the Book of the Law. And, I'm certain that you've probably never read this demonic work, and yet I know for a fact that we've all been influenced by the doctrines of demons found in Crowley's Book of the Law. The reason I know this is because the doctrines of demons that are found in Crowley's writings have been repeated and regurgitated by the disciples of Crowley for many, many years now. And to sum it up simply, the primary doctrine found in the Book of Law is simply stated in this way: "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." In other words, the demonic doctrine that Crowley was promoting in the Book of the Law was based on the goal of encouraging people to just go do whatever they want to do. You see, Satan doesn't need us to worship him. He doesn't need us to serve him. He just wants us to worship ourselves and serve ourselves, because that is Satanism. With this as the goal, Crowley set out to destroy the church by leading people to just do whatever their hearts desire. And here's how Crowley explained it in his mission statement, and I quote, "Let me seduce the boys, then these boys become men and bring about the new heaven and the new earth." And then he went on to say, "Without an army, I'm useless. Give me an army of young men, and we will sweep those dogs into the sea." The dogs that he was wanting to sweep into the sea, well, this is a reference to the leaders of the Christian church. What this means is that the doctrine, "do what thou wilt," is diametrically opposed to the doctrines of Christ that should be taught in the church. Now, I'll remind you, Crowley was the man who wanted to become Satan's chief of staff, and after receiving the doctrines of demons from this fallen angel Oice, Crowley then went on to seduce young men with his satanic agenda so that they might help him go and seduce the world with his demonic doctrines, thereby ushering in the new age. And with that being the case, we should take a moment to ask, did Crowley find his young disciples? And it's sad to say that the answer is yes. Aleister Crowley most certainly found an army of young men who were happy to go and seduce the world with his doctrines of demons. And to prove my point, you might be interested to know that it was 20 years after the death of Aleister Crowley when a group of English rock stars released their 8th album, which was titled Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It's interesting to note that the lyrics of this title track begins in this way. It was 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. Now, as we consider these lyrics, you might be interested to know that this album was released 20 years after the death of Aleister Crowley. And with that, it seems possible to me that the Beatles were referring to Aleister Crowley in this song, Sgt. Pepper. Well, to further make my case, it'll help you to know that Crowley, who wanted to serve Satan as his chief of staff, was seducing an army of young boys to help him destroy the Christian church. And it stands to reason then that if the Beatles answered Crowley's call, then it's possible that Sgt. Pepper was actually a symbolic homage which was designed to pay their respects to their military commander who died of a heroin overdose 20 years prior to the song's release. And I realize that this could seem like a bit of a stretch, and so I want to continue to consider the available evidence. You might not know this, but the Sgt. Pepper's album cover contains a crowd of people who are standing behind the band, and according to Paul McCartney, the plan was for their album cover to include a wall of their favorite heroes. And listen, in the top left corner of this top-selling album, there's a picture there of Aleister Crowley. Now remember, according to Paul McCartney, this crowd of people is made up of their heroes. Therefore, Aleister Crowley was, if nothing else, a hero of the Beatles. And with that being the case, then it's not difficult to imagine that the Beatles were writing the song Sgt. Pepper's about their hero. To further prove my point, I should point out here that John Lennon once explained that the whole Beatle idea was to do what you want. Then in order to explain what he meant, Lennon declares, "Do what thou wilt, as long as it doesn't hurt somebody." Now, in order to understand the origin of Lennon's words, it'll help us to understand that the demon who was influencing Aleister Crowley led him to reverse the words that Jesus prayed before his crucifixion. Jesus prayed, "Not my will, but thine be done." And yet, a Weiss led Crowley to write, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Therefore, John Lennon was seducing his audience with the central doctrine of Aleister Crowley's Book of the Law. And listen, not only were the Beatles part of Aleister Crowley's evil army, but so was the English band known as the Rolling Stones. In the same year when Sgt. Pepper's album was released, the Rolling Stones also released an album titled Their Satanic Majesty's Request. In their next album, Beggar's Banquet, they sang their famous anthem, Sympathy for the Devil. Clearly, these guys weren't trying to hide their love for Satan, and in light of their satanic agenda, is there evidence to believe that they too were part of Aleister Crowley's army? Well, in order to establish this connection, it'll help you to know that there was a film producer named Kenneth Anger who was also a devoted disciple of Aleister Crowley, and according to one Rolling Stone biographer named Tony Sanchez, we learned that it was 1966 when Kenneth Anger began to teach Mick Jagger and Keith Richards about the powers and the ideas of Aleister Crowley. And Mick Jagger apparently accepted these teachings because he went on to compose the musical score for Kenneth Anger's film called Lucifer Rising, which was a film dedicated to Aleister Crowley. Furthermore, there's Jim Morrison and the other members of the Doors. They actually took a picture and posed with a bust of Aleister Crowley for their album 13. Led Zeppelin's Jimmy Page purchased the house that Aleister Crowley once lived in. And he also practiced Crowley's satanic rituals live on stage during Zeppelin's concerts. He also had the vinyl of their album Led Zeppelin 3 inscribed with Crowley's famous law, "Do what thou wilt," in the runoff matrix. Without debate, Aleister Crowley found a group of young men who could help him seduce the world with his doctrines of demons. As a matter of fact, David Bowie, Prince, Sting, Daryl Hall, King Diamond, Bruce Dickinson, and Ozzy Osbourne, they were all soldiers who were sent to seduce us with Crowley's demonic doctrines. Marilyn Manson also once stated that Crowley was one of his favorite authors, and he often quotes Crowley's teachings in his lyrics. And while we would expect bands like Coil and Tool and Murder City Devils to promote Crowleyism, we also find pop stars like 50 Cent and Keisha and Lady Gaga and Jay-Z seducing their fans with the same doctrines. Case in point, Jay-Z had a clothing line called Rockaware, and not only does he cover his clothing with Masonic symbols and pentagrams and obelisks and pyramids and the all-seeing eye and these sorts of things, but he also explicitly expressed his adherence to Crowley's satanic doctrines by producing and wearing a hoodie that explicitly states, "Do what thou wilt," on the front of it. Time would fail me to just take the time to analyze all the modern artists who have explicitly embraced and endorsed the satanic teachings of Aleister Crowley. So just let it suffice to say that the majority of pop music today is brainwashing our kids with this doctrine of demons. And it's sad to say that most Christian parents today are allowing their kids to be seduced by these false teachers who are being indoctrinated by these servants of Satan. Christian, listen. There are evil spirits out there who are attempting to seduce our kids by filling their minds with the doctrines of demons, and they also want to lead us astray with the same demonic doctrines. And while, listen, we would never take our kids to the church of Satan and allow them to be brainwashed by some devil worshiper, and yet this is essentially what we do when we allow our kids to spend time listening to all these musicians who are preaching, "Do what thou wilt." With that being the case, I encourage you to heed the warning that Paul presented when he warned us about the latter times when some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. Rather than allowing your children to be seduced by the servants of Satan, and rather than filling your own mind with the "do what thou wilt" doctrine, I encourage you, cleanse your home from these doctrines of demons. And in this way, we will fight the good fight of faith, and all for the glory of God.